Alright, so what I'm going to be doing really is I'm not going to talk specifically about the research we've done, but what we're going to try and do in this next 15 minutes is try and compare the beef industry or the meat industry to the produce sector, because in reality we've got common problems, but they approach them in a slightly different way. Now, when I got into the fresh produce game, it was about 1994, I've forgotten, I don't know, but what it was is Marks and Spencer's, who was a retailer at the time, were confounded by the fact that they were getting this baby spinach and they were washing it, but we were getting one log reduction, and they wanted us to determine why do we only get a one log reduction. And that's where we led into this work about internalisation to the tissue. It moved on to looking at different processes in terms of washing, etc. And another aspect of our research was looking at beef intervention, steam pasteurisation, things like that. And so what I'm going to do is kind of bring those expertises together or experiences together in order to see what similarities are, but how the meat industry actually went a very different route, and the fresh produce industry should go that route. So commonalities is pathogens, isn't it? I think I had this last night with my health, but typically things like E. coli, Shigella maybe not so much, Salmonella, Listeria, but the one that really is common is E. coli 157. We had the Romaine lettuce outbreaks, we had the hamburger disease in the Jack in the Box, and E. coli 157 and other non-O157 sugar toxin E. colis are really becoming of concern because they're very virulent, had very low numbers, 10 to 100 susceptible hosts, but they can persist in the environment for a very long time. And a few weeks ago, I was on TV doing an interview about this poor boy, 2 years old, who had died from the romaine lettuce outbreak. And the parents went on just to say, why can't the produce industry make their produce safe? It was quite a moving story, so if you actually go on the internet, you can see that. And they've got a very good question, isn't it? That's a very good question to have. Because when we look at outbreaks, certainly produce is a leading cause of the outbreaks and also a leading cause of illnesses. And when we look at meat, isn't it, it's usually the thing, isn't it, lack of a meat thermometer, cross-contamination. We were in a restaurant last night where somebody said we should have our hamburgers medium rare. I don't think we took them on that, did we? But this is a thing. If you've got meat, you usually cook it. But with fresh produce, the old excuse is saying, oh, well, it's a raw material. You know, we haven't got any interventions. It's what gets in the field, comes straight to the plate, and we can't do anything except, you know, we'll test things and we'll do good agricultural practice and things like that. But when you look at the fresh produce industry and the meat industry, they've got very contrasting ways of approaching food safety. So obviously the meat industry is USDA, Department of Agriculture, which was formed in 1890, and their responsibility, as you all know, is usually meat and processed eggs. And the reason why those two were chosen is at the time, these were a leading cause of foodborne illness. Obviously today, produce might be slipped into their thing if they wanted it, but I don't think they actually want it. Now the important thing is, with the USDA, they had what we call prescriptive regulations. So they basically told you what to do, how to do it, and mandatory hazard, the hazard of critical control points. So they focused on 3 or 4 points in the chain where they could exercise the control. Now, the FDA was kind of shifted out of the USDA because there was this conflict of interest. You know, the FDA essentially are for protecting people's health, whereas the USDA is promoting the industry. So you could see a conflict of interest occurring. Now, the trouble with the FDA is that they got pushed from pillar to post and through lots of different departments that had all these range of products. And what they really say is, look, we can't control all these products. But what we'll do, we'll get FSMA involved, and we'll have Harp C. Harp C, in my mind, is a big disaster. You know, they had the GFSI coming in. They could have adopted that, but no, they said FSMA, Food Safety Plan Preventive Controls is the key. And the thing is, they won't tell you how to do it. They'll say, we need this, we need that, but we're not going to be prescriptive in telling you what to do. So you've got different kind of approaches. So what happens in the meat industry? They get interventions. They get to the point where they're washing the cows before or steers, should I say, get technical. Before they enter the slaughterhouse, they have controlled air, they have steam pasteurization, acid washes, steam vacuuming, N60 testing. So all these interventions in place. And when you look at E. coli 157 in beef, what you can see here is that the E. coli 157 has come down, and that's correlated with interventions, well, I've just mentioned, increasing. This is Canadian data. But it's obvious, isn't it? Have interventions in place. You're not relying on just testing. Now, when we look at the fresh produce, as Nick rightly said, we always think about it as a chain, don't we? Saying, well, we start off on the farm and the E. coli gets introduced somehow by wild animals or whichever, and it gets into the water gets into the field is irrigated, and that gets onto the romaine lettuce, and it ends up in the consumer. But in reality, it's not a chain. Basically, it's a circle. It's circulating. And salmonella is classic for this one, E. coli 157 as well. So we don't think about it as a continuum. We think about, we release it into the environment, it gets where it wants to be, and it just spreads across. So it's a shared responsibility. So when we look at the romaine lettuce outbreak, those 3 that we had not so long ago, obviously the big cause was irrigation water. So they said, well, it get runoff from the cattle feedlot into the irrigation water, it gets onto the lettuce, we process it, and away we go. Now, when you look at the beef industry, they handle recalls very differently. You don't see somebody from JBS saying, I'm going to go on TV and just tell everyone about this recall. We get on with the recall with no real issue, and that's good. Now, the produce industry is a bit different. They go in defense mode, and I'm told I'm not allowed to say too much on this one, so I'll go by Dr. Oz, who had this salad summit after the outbreak of the second outbreak of romaine lettuce. And they had all these so-called, I shouldn't say that. They had all these experts on board from the industry, and they were saying, oh yes, the produce industry is safe. We give safe product. We've got all these systems in place. 2 months later, they had another romaine lettuce outbreak. And when you look at the perishable pundit, he said, he had an article in the Lancet saying, well, we have 6 people who died, but think about all the produce we actually eat and consume. It's a tip of the iceberg. It's just a little bit. But that's not what you tell customers, is it? You don't tell consumers saying, well, collateral damage. And that's the thing about the food produce industry where it has to change. Now, the thing with the produce industry, as they say, well, we haven't got any interventions, we can't really do much, but we do have a post-harvest wash. And for many years, the post-harvest wash was the intervention. It was our CCP, wasn't it? And, when you look at various processing lines, this is in Toronto, the water isn't exactly pristine. As in, how are you going to decontaminate anything in water that you can stand a spoon up in, kind of thing, isn't it? And it's not, and this is a lettuce line, lots of latex, lots of chlorophyll. The water quality really goes down quickly. So, as I mentioned at the start, what spurred all this research was that industry was saying, look, we can go to a lab, we can inoculate E. coli, and we can get all these log reductions, 4 or 5 log reductions. But when we go into the commercial scale, it's a complete disaster. Sometimes we actually add contamination onto it. And there's different reasons for that: internalization, cut edges, vacuum cooling, biofilms. But really what the big cause was about the post-harvest wash, which was controlled by chlorine. Now, Trevor, back in 97, I think you're proud of that paper that you wrote in terms of a guideline to ORP. ORP is an indirect measure of chlorine, basic oxidation reduction potential. If that's at 850 or 650, your chlorine's good. But if you actually go to measure the free chlorine in tanks, it's not. It oscillates and it's usually depleted. So your ORP is high and looks stable. But the reality is your free chlorine's low. And what happens when you don't have free chlorine in? Cross-contamination, low decontamination, isn't it? Now, the reason why we get this depletion of free chlorine is its interaction with constituents. So with the constituents like amines, ammonia, and other things you find in produce water, they react to form these disinfection byproducts which don't have, not much antimicrobial activity, but the ORP remains high. So we're getting to a position now saying, oh yes, that's right, so we don't get enough sanitizer in. Now, the reason why we don't get much sanitizer is we always work below the break points. So as I showed you with some of the products or the wash systems there, they get kind of organicked up, a bit turbid very quickly. And so basically you're fighting a losing battle. You're adding chlorine into it, but you're not getting to that break point where you get free chlorine, which can be effective. So the industry said, look, all right, we can't decontaminate everything. What we could do, why don't we stop cross-contamination? That's an easier thing to do, isn't it? And so here, if you maintain a chlorine level, that's going to stop one E. coli jumping onto another, from one lettuce to another lettuce. And I thought, that's easy, isn't it? Because we could validate our process controls by saying, if we have enough chlorine in our wash tank, then that shows our control. We're not decontaminating, we're just preventing cross-contamination. And there was a certain individual from the FDA who had a working group, I won't mention names. It was a total disaster. They couldn't even agree on the free chlorine concentration required, not even to mention everything else. So you get into this situation where you've got all these, it's very difficult to control, not only free chlorine, but how long does it take an E. coli to go from one piece of lettuce to the next? They debated that for 2 weeks, I think. Never did get the answer. So in terms of the wash process then, I think people have practically given up with it. I think what they're trying to do now is reduce the actual chlorine concentrate or chlorine demand. And what they're trying to do is get metrics. So ORP, very convenient, but it doesn't work. We've shown that. What about turbidity? No, that doesn't work either because you've got low molecular weights. Chemical oxygen demand is very good, but it's sort of offline. But people are looking at things like UV absorption and even getting direct chlorine sensors. And so, in a way, what they're trying to do is get water recycling technologies, and we've worked on a few. This is one we installed at that plant when we just showed you in the early stages, which basically can clean the water up continuously as it's processed. So we can look at things like AOP, advanced oxidation process, in order to reduce the chlorine demand. We can oxidize those sort of constituents. And the reality is that, as I mentioned at the top, the industry needs to change. You can do your testing, you can do your good agricultural practice. Being a farmer, as you know, is a difficult job. Your E. coli is one thing, plant pathogens another, trying to get the crop in. And when I first started in this sort of business all those years ago, that's exactly what a farmer said to me, saying, look, if you can get a post-harvest decontamination method, then we can focus on being farmers, and that's good. So to take home then, obviously the meat industry have been very rapid to adapt new technologies, interventions, and that's why they've decreased the sugar toxin E. coli. The produce industry hang on to their wash systems and they're trying to, as I say, they've given up decontaminating them. So what we'll do is that we'll stop cross-contamination, but even then, that's not easy. And so really what it's talking about is the need for new decontamination technology, something thinking out the box. And with that in mind, I'm going to introduce, I'm going to introduce Paul Moyer, who is a collaborating partner, unless we've fallen out recently. And he came with a problem, the problem being listeria on apples. And we've been working on decontamination methods, and with his hindsight and his vision, he made it a reality. But I'll leave certainly Paul to say all those things himself.